Hello everyone, it's time to talk about the biosphere now, and last time we asked what happens when we think about all the ecosystems of the world as one giant interconnected ecosystem, and what we get is the biosphere. So we define the biosphere as the totality of all the ecosystems on Earth, and if you remember, the ecosystem includes not just the life itself, but also all of the non-biological factors that life interacts with. So you can really think of the biosphere as one global ecosystem that has many different forms. But the biosphere is not exactly like an ecosystem because it is more or less a closed system. So what do I mean by an open or closed system? Well, in an open system, things can go in or out, and in a closed system, nothing can go in or out. It is, in fact, that simple, and nearly all ecosystems on the Earth are open. We talked about it last time. Things can go out of one ecosystem into another. There is always energy moving into and out of ecosystems, but for the biosphere that is not so true. So even though the biosphere is almost a closed system, it isn't actually completely closed. So what does actually come into and go out of the biosphere? Well, what comes in is sunlight, and that represents an awful lot of energy, and ultimately it provides all life with the energy it needs to live. There is also cosmic rays, which are mostly ineffective against anything on Earth, but they do pass directly through the biosphere, and they do not come from the sun, they come from the background radiation of the Big Bang and other galaxies and things like that. There are also meteors. Sometimes space rocks fall to Earth and they bring in a small amount of material, of matter, of different elements. They haven't brought any weird alien life yet, or have they? We might come back to that. There's also volcanic emissions, because in fact the biosphere does not include the hot center of the Earth. So gases coming up from under the crust are technically coming into the biosphere too. So that's what's coming into the biosphere. As you can see, it's not an awful lot. The sunlight is the most significant thing. But what about what's going out of the biosphere? So every day we do lose a tiny bit of the atmosphere. There's just a few hydrogen and helium atoms, or maybe a few heavier atoms, that manage to sneak out of the top of the atmosphere and are lost into space. This is actually something that happens to all planets over time, and Mars millions of years ago had much more of an atmosphere than it does today. So one day the Earth will lose its atmosphere. It will just take a very long time. The only other thing that goes out really is the small amount of material that we have sent out in space launches. A few probes and the like have been sent out of the biosphere, and they will never come back in. So we have a model of the biosphere, and that breaks it into 4 different areas. They are very different in character, but they mix together to create the whole, which is the biosphere. And the 4 different areas of the biosphere are the Ecosphere, the Atmosphere, the Hydrosphere, and the Lithosphere. So first of all we have the Ecosphere, and here we are really just referring to all of the life systems, whether it's on land, sea or air, all of the animals, plants and microorganisms. That is the Ecosphere, and here we are really only talking about the biomass, the living matter. We are not talking about the rest. That comes in other spheres. Next we have the atmosphere, and you must know what this is. It's the mixture of gases over the surface that we need to survive. We need it to breathe, and it also protects against the sun's rays, although maybe it didn't always. The hydrosphere is the moving system of all the water in the world, and it mixes with all the other three spheres because a lot of life is made of water. There is always a lot of water floating around in the weather systems, and of course water works its way through many parts of the Earth's crust and rock structure. And that rock structure is the lithosphere. Finally, the lithosphere is basically the crust and the upper part of the mantle where rock is still rock and not liquid. And this basically goes from the surface to between 5 to 200 kilometers down. This is a very wide estimate, but the different parts of the Earth's crust have very different compositions. So the lithosphere is split into tectonic plates which move around, and they are responsible for changing the land of the Earth over time. So let's just summarize how the biosphere fits together, and the four regions of the biosphere are found basically on the very surface of the Earth. If you think of the Earth, you have the solid inner core, the liquid outer core, and then the liquid mantle, and then finally you come up to the upper mantle and the crust. And here you can see that the atmosphere, the ecosphere, the lithosphere and the hydrosphere are all found in the tiniest thin layer on the surface of the Earth. So how did life on Earth begin? How did the biosphere start? The short answer is we don't really know exactly. We have some theories about how the biosphere began, but we don't really know at this point. We do not have any solid proof. So one common thought is about 3.5 billion years ago, chemical processes formed organic molecules, and there are some theories on how this took place. Radiation from the sun or inside the Earth might have helped. We do know that phospholipids, otherwise known as fats, can form membranes on their own in water, which would have helped cells to form. And these first organic molecules are sometimes referred to as the primordial soup. And on Earth, at least, one possible place that they would have started is in the deep ocean near to hydrothermal vents. And these are places where superhot water is belched out from the mantle beneath the Earth's crust. So over time, the molecules that were created there, or wherever they were created, they formed the first cells, and from there evolution could begin. And fossil records show that photosynthesis had begun about 2.5 billion years ago. So here are the first organisms to create energy from the sun, at least we think they are. They are cyanobacteria. They are also some of the first eukaryotes, cells which had nuclei and which had organelles inside, more able to evolve into complex life. And they were also the first organisms to completely change the biosphere by their presence, because they created the oxygen revolution. They created oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, and this changed the composition of the atmosphere and probably caused the death of many other organisms that were living at that time. Most of the other organisms had not evolved to survive in an oxygen atmosphere, and the chemistry of oxygen meant that they very quickly died. So it had to start somewhere, life I mean, but it didn't necessarily need to start here on Earth. There are other theories of biogenesis, which is the word for the beginning of life in some sense. And another idea is that we actually came from outer space. This idea is called panspermia. So one theory goes that we came from Mars, that the organic processes that were needed to create life were more likely on early Mars or one of the asteroids, because less atmosphere and so more solar radiation to create the conditions for the primordial soup. So the organic molecules would then have been blasted to Earth by a meteor, and then the biosphere started from there. So, just to show that very quickly, here is the Earth, here is Mars, here is radiation creating the biological processes needed to create organic material on Mars, but then at least some of that organic material could have been blasted to Earth, and then over many millions of years it could have started the biosphere on Earth. And meteor craters like the one we see pictured here show that some pretty large meteors have hit in the past, and they could have brought all sorts of organic material with them. Or what about another possibility? Comets that pass by the Earth. Sometimes they drop material into the path of Earth, sometimes they actually hit Earth. And we know they have an awful lot of frozen water on them. Maybe the first organic processes happened here. Scientists are now investigating this possibility, although nothing has been shown yet. So there's a lot we don't know about the biosphere, but one thing we do know is that we're only just beginning to understand how the biosphere works, and more to the point, we are only just realizing that it's not actually invincible, and that the way we have managed to master the use of energy in the last 100 years or so, we are creating a system which is beginning to put pressure on the other parts of the biosphere. So that's all we're going to talk about for today, and next time we're going to look at a slightly different theory of the biosphere, but which puts some things into perspective quite well. Bye for now.